The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Riverside Grill, casting warm patterns across the white tablecloths. Margaret Hayes moved between the tables with the practiced grace of someone who'd been doing this work for 30 years. At 58, she knew every corner of this restaurant, every creak in the floorboards, every regular customer by name and preferred order. She smoothed her vest and adjusted her name tag, preparing for the dinner rush that would soon begin. The restaurant was already filling with business people and families, the gentle hum of conversation mixing with the soft classical music playing overhead. That's when she heard it. A child crying. Not the brief whimper of a scraped knee or the temporary fuss of a tired toddler, but the deep, inconsolable sobbing that spoke of something more profound. Margaret turned toward the sound and saw them at table 12, near the window overlooking the river. A man in an expensive navy suit sat rigidly, his jaw clenched, staring at the crying boy beside him as if he were a puzzle with missing pieces. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old, dressed in a button-down shirt that seemed too formal for his small frame. His face was red and streaked with tears, his small body shaking with each sob. The other diners were beginning to notice. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. Margaret watched as the man leaned toward the boy, his voice low and urgent, though she couldn't hear the words. Whatever he was saying wasn't working. If anything, the child cried harder. Margaret had seen her share of difficult situations over the years. She'd comforted anniversary couples when reservations were lost, calmed angry customers when orders were wrong, even helped a woman who went into labor before her appetizer arrived. But something about this scene pulled at her heart in a different way. She approached the table slowly, giving them space, her hands folded in front of her apron. As she got closer, she could hear the man's frustrated whispers. "Please, Connor. Not here. Not again. You need to stop this. People are looking!" The boy named Connor only cried harder, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "Good evening," Margaret said gently, her voice calm and warm. "My name is Margaret, and I'll be taking care of you both today." The man looked up at her, and she saw exhaustion in his eyes. Deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. "We need a few minutes," he said tightly. "I'm sorry about the noise." "No apology needed," Margaret said, crouching down slightly so she was eye level with Connor. She didn't speak to him immediately, just waited, letting him feel her presence. His crying continued, but she noticed his eyes flicker toward her briefly. "You know what?" Margaret said softly, addressing Connor directly. "I bet you're thirsty. Crying is hard work. Would you like something to drink?" The boy's sobs hitched slightly. He didn't answer, but he was listening. "We have apple juice, lemonade, chocolate milk." She paused, watching his face. "Or maybe just a nice cold glass of regular milk?" Something shifted in Connor's expression. The crying quieted to sniffles. "Would you like that?" Margaret asked. "A big glass of milk?" Connor nodded, just barely, still hiccuping through his tears. "1 glass of milk coming right up," Margaret said, rising to her feet. She glanced at the father. "And for you, sir? Coffee black, please." The word please sounded like it took effort. "Of course. I'll be right back." As Margaret walked toward the kitchen, she felt the weight of every eye in the dining room. Her co-worker, Jenny, a bright-eyed woman in her 20s, caught her arm. "Table 12 is Thomas Brennan," Jenny whispered urgently. "As in Brennan Holdings. As in Billionaire Thomas Brennan. Are they okay? Do you need me to take it?" "They're fine," Margaret said quietly. "I've got them." In the kitchen, Margaret poured the milk herself, making sure the glass was perfectly clean, the milk cold and fresh. She added a straw, then on impulse, she asked the pastry chef for one of the chocolate chip cookies they usually saved for special occasions. When she returned to the table, Connor was no longer crying, but his face was still blotchy, his breathing uneven. Thomas Brennan sat with his hands clasped on the table, staring at his phone, as if it might provide answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Here we are," Margaret said, placing the milk in front of Connor with gentle care. "1 glass of milk, nice and cold. And this," she set down the cookie on a small plate, "is because I think you could use something sweet." Connor's eyes widened slightly. He looked at his father, uncertain. Thomas glanced at the cookie, then at Margaret, then back at his son. It's It's fine. You can have it. Margaret placed the coffee in front of Thomas. I'll give you both a few minutes to look at the menu. No rush at all. She moved away to tend to other tables, but she kept table 12 in her peripheral vision. She watched as Connor slowly reached for the glass of milk, his small hands wrapping around it carefully. He took a sip, then another. The tension in his small shoulders began to ease just slightly. Thomas picked up his menu but didn't seem to read it. His eyes kept drifting to his son, watching him drink the milk with an expression that Margaret recognized. It was the look of someone who desperately wanted to fix something, but didn't know where to begin. Over the next 20 minutes, Margaret checked on them twice. Each time, Connor was a little calmer. He'd eaten the cookie in tiny bites, savoring each one. He still hadn't spoken, but the crisis had passed. When she returned to take their order, Thomas ordered for them both. The grilled chicken for him, plain. No sauce, and I'll have the salmon. Excellent choices, Margaret said. And Connor, how's that milk treating you? The boy looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. It's good, he whispered, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. I'm so glad, Margaret said. Would you like another glass? Connor nodded. As the dinner service continued, Margaret found herself drawn back to table 12 more than necessary. She brought Connor his second glass of milk. She made sure his chicken was cut into manageable pieces. She noticed that Thomas barely touched his salmon. His attention constantly divided between his phone, his son, and the window overlooking the darkening river. When she brought dessert menus, Thomas waved them away. Just the check, please. Of course. Margaret prepared the bill, her mind working. Something told her to wait, to pay attention. She'd learned long ago to trust these instincts. When she returned with the check, Thomas was on his phone again, speaking in low, tense tones. I don't care what the board says. Reschedule it. No, I can't do Thursday. Because I said so. He hung up and immediately pulled out his wallet, placing a credit card on the bill without looking at the total. Margaret processed the payment and returned with the receipt. Thomas signed it quickly, adding a generous tip without seeming to notice the amount. He stood buttoning his suit jacket. Come on, Connor. We need to go. Connor slid off his chair obediently, but as they turned to leave, something happened that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. The boy stopped. He turned back to look at her, his eyes finding hers across the space between them. And then, in a voice that was small but clear, he said, Thank you for the milk. It was such a simple thing, 5 words. But the way he said them, with such careful sincerity, made Margaret's throat tighten. You're very welcome, sweetheart, she managed to say. Thomas had paused, too, turning back to see why his son had stopped. He looked at Margaret, really looked at her for the first time all evening. Thank you, he said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Something vulnerable. For being kind. That's what we're here for, Margaret said gently. They left and Margaret cleared their table, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. But her mind was elsewhere, with that little boy and his exhausted father, wondering what struggles they carried that she couldn't see. She didn't expect to see them again. But 3 days later, there they were. Table 12, the same time, late afternoon before the dinner rush. Connor in another too formal shirt, Thomas in another expensive suit. This time Connor wasn't crying, but he looked anxious, his small hands fidgeting with the napkin. Margaret approached with the same calm warmth. Well, hello again. It's good to see you both. Hello, Thomas said. There was something different in his voice, less defensive perhaps. Connor, Margaret said, crouching down to his level again. I remember you. You like milk, don't you? The boy nodded, and the smallest hint of a smile touched his lips. Would you like a glass now? Yes, please. Coming right up. This visit went more smoothly. Connor ate his dinner without incident. He was quiet, but he seemed more settled. When Margaret brought him a second glass of milk without being asked, he thanked her immediately, the words coming more easily this time. Over the following weeks, they became regulars. Every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork, Thomas and Connor would arrive at table 12. Margaret made sure she was always the one to serve them. Slowly, carefully, she began to learn their story, Not all at once, but in pieces, gathered from small comments and gentle observations. Connor's mother had died 2 years ago. Cancer, fast and cruel. Thomas had thrown himself into work, building his business empire even higher, perhaps trying to outrun his grief. But grief, Margaret knew, couldn't be outrun, and neither could the needs of a small boy who'd lost his mother. Connor barely spoke to anyone. At school, he was quiet to the point of concern. At home, Thomas employed a series of nannies who never seemed to last more than a few weeks. The crying fits happened regularly, triggered by things Thomas couldn't predict or understand. Margaret learned all this not from one conversation, but from many. A comment here, an overheard phone call there. She never pried, but she listened when they needed her to. And somewhere along the way, something shifted. Connor started talking to her. Not long conversations, but small exchanges. He told her about his toy cars, about a test at school where he got all the answers right, about a dog he saw in the park. Thomas started to relax too. His shoulders didn't look quite so rigid. He began ordering without looking at his phone. He even smiled once when Connor told Margaret a joke he'd learned from his teacher. One evening in early autumn, after they'd finished their meal, Thomas asked Margaret something unexpected. "Do you have children?" Margaret paused, her hand resting on the back of an empty chair. "I do, 2 grown sons. James is 32, lives in Seattle with his wife and daughter, and Michael is 29, just got engaged last month." "Do you see them often?" "Not as much as I'd like," Margaret said honestly. "They have their own lives now, but we talk every week and they visit when they can." Thomas nodded slowly. What was it like? Raising them? It was such a big question asked so simply,